This is Jamie Drummond for Good Food Revolution. I'm absolutely delighted today to say that we are in the company of Charlotte Horton, someone we haven't been chatting with since, goodness, 2014 when you were in Toronto for Terroir all those years ago. How are you today, Charlotte?
Well, it's positively torrid at the moment in Italy. We have a bit of a heat wave that's called Lucifero, which means Lucifer. So you can imagine it's infernal, literally.
Yes.
So yes, I enjoyed our chat, and I looked at it recently, actually, Jamie, and our chat that we had when I was doing Terroir. And what is wonderful about what happened with the Terroir relationship, because that was really my first experience with Terroir,
yes,
is that we work together quite a lot now. So Arlene and Terroir, we've done an event here at the castle, Terroir Tuscany, looking at food chain possible potential problems, which many have, I must say, emerged since we discussed some of the potential problems. So that some of the discussions were definitely prophetic. And I work a lot with Arlene and Terroir, and we've become great friends. So, that's a really positive thing that came out of the Toronto visit. So
I've been following that from afar through the wonders of the internet. So I'm aware of all of that. Now, we're here today to speak about a book that you're publishing. A Tuscan Adventure, Castello Potentino, The Restoration of a Castle. And although we didn't mention it too much in the interview, would you mind speaking about how you came about restoring this wonderful Tuscan castello?
Well, I have to say, when I start telling this story, I realize how incredibly eccentric and mad it is. There's no other real explanation for what me and my family have done. My grandmother, to be correct, my step-grandmother bought a house on the coast here in the 1970s, in the area which is now known as the Maremma.
Yes.
Now, the Maremma was, in the 1970s, still a little bit prone to banditry and kidnapping, and it was quite a wild area.
Really?
And it had a recent history of malaria. So the malaria had not really disappeared until the Americans sprayed the marshes beautifully with DDT in the 1940s after the war. So there had still been cases of malaria in the 50s and the 60s popping up. But it was a bit like the Camargue, so these marshlands with cowboys and longhorn cattle, and pretty wild and extremely beautiful. And not many people were coming to that area because it was considered a bit the back of beyond. Yes. So she was very brave. She met a woman at a bus stop when she was researching a series of travel books that she was doing, quite avant-garde travel books about traveling to the small islands, so Elba, Giglio, and lesser known parts of the Mediterranean.
Yes.
So she was researching on the island of Crete, and she was waiting for a bus, and she met a woman at the bus stop who turned out to be Italian, and they chitty-chatted away, and the Italian woman asked Helga, my grandmother, what she was doing there. She said, well, I'm doing research for this book, but we're also looking for a place to retire in the Mediterranean. And this woman said, oh, you don't want to Crete. Crete's not as beautiful as this wonderful place in southern Tuscany called the Maremma. So my grandmother didn't really take much notice of that. She went on her way. But several months after this, I think a couple of months after this, she got a telegram from this woman saying, I put a deposit on a house for you in southern Tuscany near the coast. And you know what? My grandmother was, obviously my step-grandmother was very adventurous, and she just thought, let's go and look at it. Let's go and see this area. And of course, she fell in love with it. And We then subsequently, as a child, had all our holidays in that area.
Yes.
And essentially just fell in love with it. Our neighbors had beautiful white oxen that they used to plow the fields with. And that has stuck in my memory as something so extraordinary, because as I grew up and I began to learn more about the Etruscans, who the ancient civilization that lived in that area prior to the Romans, they plowed their land with oxen, and this always fascinated me. So I think that as a young girl, these extraordinary vestiges of life and a way of living, and the type of food that we were eating always completely fascinated me. So it got into my heart and into my little brain, and I really fell in love with Italy. So when my grandmother died, the family inherited the house. And because my family are definitely a bit eccentric, they decided that it would be really fun to go and buy something a little bit bigger in Tuscany. So this adventure with buying ruined castles started.
Because Potentino is not your first venture into castle restoration, is it?
No, it's the second castle,
Yes.
which makes it sound more ridiculous. But the thing that people don't really realize is in the 1980s, the mid 1980s, there were a lot of enormous properties and these palaces and castles that had been abandoned. Nobody really knew what to do with them. The type of agriculture that had supported them in the past wasn't making a lot of money. So they were being sold for the sort of price of a small house in London. Yeah. And so people don't realize that. They imagine that you must be a billionaire. Well,
this would be before the Tuscan wine boom, right?
That's right. So, I mean, I did then decide to go out and live in Italy and live at the ruined first castle, learn how to make wine. So I did see the development of the boom in the wine world in Tuscany, and in particular famous areas like Brunello. We looked at various castles and properties there that have now been developed and are very big wine estates, were ruined and being sold for absolutely nothing. So I saw all of that development, and it certainly fed into what I do with our wine at the moment, and the way that we restored the first castle and obviously the second castle, which is where I am now. So the things that I learned from the rural life in this area from the 1970s up until even now has always informed and fed into all of our projects, because it always occurred to me that there was a wonderful sustainability and a rural intelligence, a virtuous circle always, that even as a young girl I recognized. So those lessons have really, they're embedded in these buildings and these landscapes. So most of our projects really have been about continuing that, conserving that, and bringing it into the 21st century so it has sense to people today.
Now, you started your first castle restoration, that was 1989, but it was in 2000 that you purchased the current property. And I was amused to read that you had to negotiate with 22 different owners to purchase that place. And after a year of negotiations, it became yours. Now, what kind of state was the Castello in when you arrived there?
Dismal. It was absolutely dismal. Most of the roofs were falling in. All the windows and the doors were broken. everything of any value had been stolen, even the locks on the doors.
Wow.
It had basically been sacked. There are various reasons why that had happened. It had got abandoned before the Second World War, and then it had housed prisoners in the Second World War. The Germans had retreated close to the castle, so there was actually fighting in the area. A lot of the villagers had taken refuge, and people from the south of Italy had taken refuge in the castle. So it really was abandoned, essentially. And nobody had ever taken the rubbish out.
Oh, God.
Because it was so big and there were so many rooms, they just put the rubbish in one room and moved into the next room. So there was a lot of junk in the castle. It took us a very long time to actually understand what some of the rooms were like, because it was so full of rubbish.
Oh my
But
goodness.
for some reason, it's very strange, but I kind of fell in love with the castle. There was something so beautiful about it and the landscape, because it's very unusual to find a 11th century property in its original landscape. And the landscape, as we've discovered, has remained pretty much the same since Etruscan time. So you've got a continuous tradition of agriculture and use of the land that is probably about 3,000 years of uninterrupted, agricultural practice. So that fascinated me as well. But the building itself was full of mystery, and I knew it had lots of stories to tell. And we subsequently discovered that the Templars had been here. All sorts of things have emerged about the history. We know the Etruscans were here because Etruscan artifacts have been found here. So I kind of fell in love with the building, and I just knew that there was something very special about it. And it was kind of calling me and saying, will you come and save me? Yeah, make me live again. And my family, and in particular my mother, who sadly is no longer with us, had grown up in a equally old house in England, and she always loved old buildings because she knew they contained so much knowledge. They contain so many things that we can learn about because they've been around for so long. As I say, an intelligence of living, how to live intelligently. And I think that's often what buildings will give you, is that type of knowledge that comes out of thousands of years of experience, a continuum of experience.